75 years ago, in the aftermath of World War II, 12 nations came together to form the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, also known as NATO.
If there is anything inevitable in the future, it is the will of the people of the world for freedom and for peace.
Signed on April 4, 1949 in Washington, D.C., the North Atlantic Treaty was a historic commitment to ensure peace and prosperity through a community united by democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law. The original members pledged that an armed attack against one or more of them would be considered an attack against them all. 12 years later, at one of the most dangerous moments of the Cold War, the Atlantic Council was founded to advance the mission of NATO. It was a mission grounded in the transatlantic community, but extending beyond it, devoted to providing collective security and practical solutions to the world's most pressing problems. Throughout the Cold War, NATO served as a critical bulwark against Soviet expansion, conducting joint military exercises, intelligence sharing, and strategic planning. The alliance helped maintain a fragile peace in Europe and provided a platform for transatlantic cooperation. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and collapse of the Soviet Union marked a turning point for NATO. With the Cold War over, the alliance has adapted to a transformed geopolitical landscape featuring terrorism, hybrid threats, China's challenges to the international system, and the advance of authoritarianism around the globe. NATO's membership has grown significantly since its inception. The alliance now includes 32 countries, including the most recent additions, Finland and Sweden. The alliance also maintains partnerships with countries ranging from Ukraine in Europe to Australia, Japan, New Zealand, and South Korea in the Indo-Pacific, to nations across the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. Today, as they did when NATO and the Atlantic Council were born, the United States and its allies confront an inflection point in history, just as NATO has expanded its mission and ambition to meet the demands of an ever-changing world, so too has the Atlantic Council. It is in challenging times like these that the global future is shaped. This is our moment to shape that future together.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Atlantic Council for today's NATO Summit kickoff event. I'm Fred Kemp, I'm President and CEO of the Atlantic Council. As you saw in that film, 75 years ago in April, 12 countries came together to sign the Washington Treaty, marking the beginning of what would become the world's most successful and enduring military alliance. Founded in 1979, NATO sought to provide collective security and defense and prevent the outbreak of another world war. In the 75 years that have followed, it has welcomed 20 additional allies, now 32, with the addition of Sweden and Finland. NATO's founders had an advantage, I believe, that today's alliance leaders can't replicate. All of them had experienced the horrors of World War II, every one of them of the photos that you saw from the past. It was close to them. And a great many of them had personally known the ravages of World War I. So they understood the urgency of the moment. It's worth recalling Harry Truman's words, President Harry Truman's words on the occasion of the signing of the North Atlantic Treaty. And he likened the treaty to a homeowner's agreement to protect the neighborhood and to come to the aid of each other if attacked. It's worth heeding his warnings then, which are as timely today as we face the threats from a new confederation of autocrats, Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, whose defense industrial cooperation is far closer than was that of the autocrats of the late 1930s. Said Truman, and I love this quote, "We do not believe that there are blind tides of history which sweep people one way or the other. In our own time, we have seen brave people overcome obstacles that seemed insurmountable and forces that seemed overwhelming. People with courage and vision can still determine their own destiny," end quote. Blind tides of history, I've always liked that phrase. Today we face blind tides that form the greatest threats to the global system since the 1930s, or not so blind tides perhaps. Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, an ongoing conflict in the Middle East, an expansionist China with the biggest peacetime military build-up in history, all present challenges. Now, I want to show you one chart and one chart only about how NATO is already standing up to the blind tides of history. If you could put up that chart, what it shows, if we get it up, is that you have now 23 of the 32 members of NATO at 2% of defense spending, which of course is what leaders of NATO have called for a long period of time. And so you see how dramatic some of those measures are, Poland in the lead, but others that were way under 2%, way above it. There were only 3 countries at 2% when that goal was first set in Wales a decade ago. And so you'll see this will be one goal to talk about defense and deterrence. Another will be talking about Ukraine. A third will be talking about global partnerships, and our panelists will address that in a moment. Securing the future of the world's most successful alliance is going to require this summit to be one of implementation. Over the next couple of days, heads of state and government will be expected to reaffirm support for Ukraine and reinforce the alliance's eastern flank while accelerating transformation that will ensure NATO is fit for purpose in a new era with its global partnerships. We are proud at the Atlantic Council to be organizing the NATO Public Forum together with NATO, the U.S. government, our think tank consortium partners, the German Marshall Fund, the Center for New American Security, Hudson Institute, and GlobeSec, to promote a better public understanding of the key issues at hand of the Washington Summit. Much is on the agenda, and here with us to preview the Alliance's priorities and help us understand the outcomes we should watch for is the Senior Director for Europe at the U.S. First of all, Benedetta Berti, Head of Policy Planning at NATO. We've got Matt Koenig, who is the Vice President of the Atlantic Council and a Senior Director of the Scowcroft Center. We'll soon have Ambassador Michael Carpenter, the Senior Director for Europe at the U.S. Here he is, as with timing, walking right in the door. And so thank you for joining us, Mike. It's great to have you here. I know this is a busy week for you and for Benedetta. The conversation will be moderated by Courtney McBride from Bloomberg, who, like me, is an alum of the Wall Street Journal. Without further ado, I turn the floor over to Courtney.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Fred, for your opening remarks. As Fred said, I'm Courtney McBride. I'm a national security correspondent for Bloomberg News based in Washington and, to a lesser extent, on a plane with the Secretary of State. Honored to moderate this afternoon's discussion, All Eyes on Washington, What to Expect at the 2024 NATO Summit. As Fred said, we have with us Dr. Benedetta Berti, Director of Policy Planning for NATO. Dr. Matthew Koenig, Vice President at the Atlantic Council, Senior Director of the Scowcroft Center, and Ambassador Mike Carpenter, Senior Director for Europe at the National Security Council. Without further ado, I think I'd like to dive into some questions on the summit and really, particularly the key deliverables that we're hoping to see and that observers are asking about. Ukraine is expected to be the dominant issue this week with this widely discussed bridge to NATO membership, which involves a lot of components from bilateral security agreements between allies and Ukraine, additional support for Ukraine's defense industrial base, and future planning and interoperability with the alliance. But critics have said that this does not go far enough. I'm interested to hear from each of you on how to ensure that this bridge to NATO membership is a real, meaningful path forward for Ukraine and not an effort to perhaps delay difficult decisions for the alliance. So, Mike, if you want to start us off.
Happy to start off with it, hear from my colleagues here on the panel. Critics aside, I think we have a very meaty, solid deliverable for Ukraine. Of course, the Ukrainians will be the ultimate judges of whether it meets their expectations or not. But what we're looking to do here with what we have on offer called the NATO Security Assistance and Training Ukraine, that's the name of the deliverable. What this will do is it will provide Ukraine with NATO institutionalized support for training, for equipping, for logistics, for force development That will be sort of the military piece. And contrary to some of what I've seen in the press, this is not a substitute or quasi-membership action plan. This is not a plan. This is a command, a NATO command that is going to be stood up at Wiesbaden that will engage in all of these efforts alongside a political component which will have a senior civilian representative in Kyiv who will manage the sort of the larger defense institution building, NATO interoperability reform process. And then commensurate with that, there will be a financial pledge from allies to continue sustaining Ukraine at a baseline level, a minimum baseline level, based on what we've done in past years, at a minimum until the next NATO summit in a year's time. So that is sort of how we envisage this. Now, what does it mean in practice? This is what we're calling a bridge to membership, because what we want to achieve is we want Ukraine to have the capabilities, the readiness to be able to essentially plug and play with the rest of the alliance on day one when they get the invitation. So right now there's not consensus among the 32 to give them an invitation. But when that time comes, we want them to be more like a Sweden or a Finland than some other allies that have taken years to do the necessary reforms so that they can join as soon as possible. And then this, as you mentioned, together with the bilateral security agreements, with the 50 billion euro that we have pulled forward from frozen Russian assets outside of Russia, together with F-16s and air defense and other things that we're looking to give Ukraine as far as capabilities, this will collectively constitute that bridge to NATO membership.
Benedetta, did you want to?
Well, there's very little to add in the sense that these are the parameters of what we're agreeing. I think it's when you look at it together and you also take a step back and look at what we agreed 1 year ago at the Vilnius Summit when we set up the NATO Ukraine Council as a vehicle to bring Ukraine closer to NATO politically, militarily. And then you look 1 year forward and you see how the NATO Ukraine Council has been used throughout the year to foster more strategic conversation and exchanges with Ukraine, to increase that political dialogue with Ukraine, to be the engine for increased cooperation on a number of issues, from interoperability to defense cooperation to promoting innovation, to now the setup of a joint training and education center between NATO and Ukraine. All of these are elements that, as was just said, are going to bring and are bringing to Ukraine closer to NATO on a practical point of view in terms of interoperability of their armed forces with NATO forces, but also in terms of standards and doctrines, but also in terms of supporting the reform process from the defense procurement to good governance and anti-corruption, all issues that both Ukraine and NATO allies attach great importance to. So that's very practical how you build that bridge to membership. And then, of course, we are underpinning with recognizing the gravity of the situation. Ukraine can prevail, but it can prevail if we deliver what it needs for its own self-defense. And that's where the financial pledge comes in terms of the 40 billion over the next year and a commitment to sustainable and sustained and equitable support for Ukraine militarily. That's where the NATO leading role in, as was just stated, coordinating the provision of equipment and training comes in. And that's where in the background, the bilateral security agreement, the additional announcements that we're expecting in terms of increasing and providing urgently needed military equipment for Ukraine. When you put this all together, I think the political message could be clearer. Ukraine's rightful place is in the Euro-Atlantic family. Ukraine's right to self-defense is going to be supported, not just today, but well into the future. And the message is both to Ukraine that they can count on us, but also to Moscow that they cannot wait us out, because we're going to be committed to ensure that Ukraine prevails as a sovereign, independent country in its fight for freedom. So I think that's very substantial. It's really not about words or just words. It's about backing those words with long-term, concrete action. So I think we have a very strong deliverable for Ukraine.
I mean, on that question of reliability and a long-term commitment to Ukraine, there is that $40 billion pledge, but that does have to be reviewed on an annual basis. I mean, that's somewhat short of certainly what Secretary General Stoltenberg was calling for and what several allies and partners might have deemed appropriate for Ukraine. I mean, is that the best that the alliance can do? Is that sufficient?
Well, those of
a
us
first step?
that live in congressional democracies, for better or worse, congressional appropriators get a voice. And so we're not able to commit to anything outside of what Congress is obviously able to obligate and appropriate. We think that this level of ambition is the correct one for the foreseeable future. I mean, ideally, this war ends soon, and we're no longer having to provide these levels of support other than to build Ukraine's future force so that they can deter future aggression. But in the meantime, this is sort of where we've set the level of ambition. And of course, it's dependent on what allied parliaments are able to approve in terms of funding.
Matt, did you want to weigh in? I'm sorry.
I just remind everyone that the alliance, of course, has already promised that Ukraine will join NATO, going back to the 2008 Bucharest summit. And so I think it's a question of when and how, not if they join the alliance. And the dilemma we have now is if you give an invitation to join now, does that mean you're declaring war on Russia, given that there's an ongoing war? Or if not, does that weaken Article 5? And so that's the dilemma. And so I think the approach, which makes sense, is let's do all the things we need to do to get Ukraine to join NATO, military interoperability, and other things now, so it can be quick when the conditions are ripe. The only other thing I'd add is at the Atlantic Council, one of the other big questions is, does Ukraine and NATO make NATO and the United States safer or not? Or is this somehow provocative to Russia and would worsen conflict? At the Atlantic Council this spring, we did a series of war games set in the future. Ukraine's already a member of NATO. Conflict with Russia, what does that look like? And the unequivocal conclusion was that it really stabilized the situation because Russia then was much more afraid of escalation with Ukraine, afraid of war with NATO, afraid of the nuclear alliance. And so I think our conclusion is that it does make sense for Ukraine to join NATO. It does make Europe and the United States safer. So a bridge makes sense, but it should be short, it should be made of steel, and it should end with an invitation to join.
And there has been a lot of discussion of the inclusion of language rendering that bridge irreversible. The U.S. has been criticized as being perhaps an opponent of that approach. Mike, did you, can you address some of the criticism that perhaps more than some other allies in Europe that the U.S. has opposed that irreversible designation?
I don't know that that's accurate. I would say take a look at the communique when it comes out, which should be very soon. I think negotiators are polishing up the last couple sentences and paragraphs, so it'll be out soon. But in all seriousness, the language, I think, will be very strong, communicating precisely to this point that Ukraine has a future in NATO and we want to accelerate the process.
Okay. Turning to the allies' spending on defense, 10 years ago, leaders committed to spending at least 2% of their respective GDP toward defense. There have been some questions of how one defines that, but we are now at 23 of 32 allies, really 31 as we don't count Iceland toward that, spending the 2% target, which many have said is itself too low. What do you each make of the argument that really 3 to 4% of GDP is a more realistic number to meet the requirements of NATO's regional defense plans and the respective national defense plans that would nest under that?
Sure. Well, I think it's important to start exactly how you framed it, which is looking at the trajectory that we've had over the past 10 years. And if you go back to 2014, which is when essentially NATO allies decided that after decades of, frankly, underspending when it comes to our defense, we were going to start reversing that trend. Back then, the 2% target really looked aspirational. Unfortunately, our security environment has in a way helped us make the case as to why spending in defense is not a luxury, but is incredibly essential. And that case was made clearly after Russia illegally and illegitimately annexed Crimea. But unfortunately, since 2022, it's become really crystal clear that we need to accelerate that upward trajectory in defense spending. So just to say that going from 3 allies spending 2% and now 23, 2/3 of the alliance over at 2% or more is already something that we really need to recognize as a very important achievement. That said, a number of allies, including on the eastern flank, have decided that 2% is not enough for them. And if you look at countries like Poland, they're going to 4% to meet the defense requirement of this more contested security environment. So the trend is clear. And it's also clear that when you look at the last year, just in the last year, there's been an increase of 18% by European allies and Canada when it comes to defense spending. So the trajectory is positive. The understanding that 2% truly is the bottom, the bare minimum, is the ceiling, is the floor for our defense spending. I think that's already a testament to the great strategic adaptation that is occurring within the alliance. That said, I agree with you that if we look into the future and we look into fully resourcing our defense plans and preparing for all possible contingency, this will require for a number of countries to go beyond 2%. But the progress is ongoing, and the political understanding that that's the direction of travel is there. And I think that's going to be an important message coming out of the summit this week, that really 2% is a great achievement, but it's the beginning, not the end of the road, and we have to continue to push forward.
Can we expect an increase after this week?
Look, I would just echo what was just said. When President Biden took office, we had 9 allies at 2% of GDP on defense. Now we have 23. Look at the direction of travel in just 3.5 years. It's tremendous. Are we where we need to be? No, we need all 32 allies at 2%. That's a floor, as you've just said. There are individual allies who find themselves in situations where they feel the need to spend more. That is legitimate. That's the context they're in. But I think right now, let's stick with the 2% threshold. Let's get everybody there, and then we can talk about new targets.
And if I could just frame the defense spending in a little bit of a broader context, because the point, of course, is to make sure that NATO has the capabilities it needs to deter and defend in the transatlantic space. And so I think one of the other accomplishments at Vilnius last year and of this summit is this new family of regional plans, the kind of the most serious defense plans for NATO since the end of the Cold War, and making sure that allies have the capabilities they need to, and give General Cavoli the capabilities he needs to implement those plans. And so I think the direction is great, as everybody's pointed out. But I have heard estimates that getting the capabilities we need is going to require all the allies to hit 2%, but maybe even higher. At 3.6 is one number I heard from a European defense ministry. So I think a lot of progress has been made, but there's still more work to be done.
But if I could just point out, so if you look at total, across the entire alliance, total defense spending, it is increased on an annualized basis since 2020, 180 billion extra. In totality, and just in the last year, an extra 18%. So we're seeing monumental rises in spending. So again, I think the trajectory is one that this is something that everybody needs to be talking about at this summit, is how we've actually achieved a lot of what we set out to do. Collectively, we're at 2% when you take everybody together once again. So there's some individual allies that still need some encouragement, but we're headed in the right direction.
I mean, the U.S. is obviously among the allies who are meeting and exceeding the target, but there are increasing or reemerging concerns about the reliability of the United States as a NATO ally, not only due to the prospect of former President Trump returning to office, but the difficulty of passing, for instance, a supplemental funding package in support of Ukraine. What efforts are being taken from an alliance standpoint, from a U.S. standpoint, to sort of future-proof, or in some views, Trump-proof, that alliance, that partnership, to ensure that that the U.S. continues to contribute as needed?
From my side, well, let me just slightly maybe reframe some of the terminology, because I would say that what we're doing, and it's a process that really started in 2014 with the adaptation, then turbocharged after 2022, of our military deterrence and defense posture, but also of our political instruments. It's really to prepare the alliance, to prepare NATO for a world of strategic competition, where we have multiple potentially simultaneous threats and challenges, with of course, the most direct and strategic threat being the Russian Federation because of its war of aggression against Ukraine, a broader pattern of destabilizing behavior, increasingly more brazen, a hybrid operation against allies and our broader neighborhood, and that's something that requires a serious reset of our posture, which in turn requires European allies and Canada to spend more on defense. It requires re-energizing our deterrence our defense industrial bases. And it also requires us, beyond just the Russian threat, to recognize that in a world of strategic competition, we need to deal with the systemic challenges posed by the People's Republic of China that calls for integrated and more robust approach to resilience. It calls to strengthen cooperation with our partners in the Indo-Pacific region. What I'm giving you is a to-do list and issues we're working on that are really absolutely non-dependent on who is sitting in an elected office in any of our allied countries. We got to do it because that's the security requirement we operate under. So in that sense, future-proof the alliance, yes, but future-proof it to a world in which we have multiple threats and challenges potentially across theaters, and in which you really need to have a more robust and energized role for European allies and Canada. And that in turn will also strengthen the transatlantic bond, because of course it remains in the core vital national security interest, I believe, of each and every ally, including the United States, irrespective against of shifting political winds, to have a strong transatlantic alliance. In a world where you have multiple threats and challenges, allies and partners are a key force multiplier, a key asset, and I believe that will continue to be true into the future. So that would be my slight reframing, but agreement with the basic premise, which is we need to do more because the security requirement demands it.
No, I completely agree with all of that. But I would say take a look at the vote on the supplemental bill for Ukraine. And there was an overwhelming bipartisan majority in support when the vote was actually called. NATO has always been a bipartisan issue in this country. I mean, just preparing for the summit and looking at some of the speeches given by Reagan and Eisenhower and others, a lot of generations of American politicians have invested in this alliance for a reason, because it delivers for all of us. It makes us stronger. When we work through our allies and partners, we achieve more, and collectively we're all safer. So the investment that we make financially, militarily, which by the way also helps support jobs in the United States and has other benefits, but it's a force multiplier in a way that goes beyond just simply the number of allies. It's really the capabilities that are brought to bear when they're collective are much greater than just the sum of the parts.
I would just agree that I think support for NATO is bipartisan and strong in the United States. And as Fred mentioned at the top, we're honored to be putting on the public forum alongside NATO and other partners. And I think you'll see over the coming days strong support from NATO coming from both sides of the aisle, Democrats and Republicans. And you're right that President Trump had some tough words for NATO allies on burden sharing, but burden sharing is an important issue. Secretary Gates, Obama's defense secretary, also said NATO allies need to step up. And an interesting data point, the Ronald Reagan Institute did a survey recently, and self-described MAGA Republicans, their support for NATO was something like 75 or 82%. So I do think the support for NATO is bipartisan and strong, and stronger than some people might think looking at the headlines.
And I'm sorry, I will have to excuse myself since when the Oval Office calls and you work in the White House, all else unfortunately has to be put aside. So thank you very much, but I do have to run back to brief the boss. So thank you very much.
Thanks for joining me.
Yeah.
Thanks. Benedetto, you referred to China, which was played a prominent role in the latest NATO strategic concept, for which I know you had a key role in developing. You know, China is playing an increasingly disruptive role in terms of not only direct engagement within NATO countries, but also its support for Russia's defense industrial base, not necessarily directly supplying weapons, but supplying components that are allowing Russia to rebuild and in support of its attack on Ukraine. You know, what steps can NATO take this week? What should we be looking out for with respect to China? And then on a related note, I mean, the leaders of the Indo-Pacific Four, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, are here as part of the summit. How important is their presence this week? And how is the alliance going to work to kind of operationalize the strategic concept to respond to China's actions, both in the Indo-Pacific and within NATO territory?
That's a great question, and I would say I would start with the second part, which is recognizing that for the third summit in a row, so this is the third year in a row with the leadership from our 4 Indo-Pacific partners, as you stated, Australia, Japan, the Republic of Korea, and New Zealand join us at the NATO Summit. This is first of all, a recognition of the fact that these 2 theaters, the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific, are increasingly more interlinked from a security perspective. And that's something that I think our partners in the Indo-Pacific understand extremely well, and that's one of the reasons why they've been so steadfast in their support for Ukraine, because they understand very well that any situation in which Putin's war of aggression was to be proven successful in Ukraine would also be destabilizing for the international order, and also we have to wonder what type of deterrent signaling would other assertive authoritarian actors, including those sitting in Beijing, draw. What lesson would they draw about the legitimacy of the use of force? So that's one of the reasons why we have such a strong partnership and support for Ukraine from our partners in the Indo-Pacific. But I think the opposite is also true. We're also understanding that any security crisis of conflicts or instability in the Indo-Pacific would also have a direct impact on Euro-Atlantic security. So that's a powerful rationale for our increased both political dialogue but also practical cooperation. And I think at this summit you will see specifically that we are going to highlight a few areas where more cooperation is going to be carried forward with our Indo-Pacific partners, being on defense cooperation, being on countering hybrid threats, being on cybersecurity, but also promoting interoperability and working on defense cooperation, which is an issue where I think we have a joint objective. Both as Euro-Atlantic allies, we are taking steps to strengthen our transatlantic defense industrial base, but that also provides opportunities to increase defense cooperation, of course with Ukraine, but also with our partners in the Indo-Pacific. So I think these are some of the issues that will be highlighted at the summit in terms of our agenda for practical cooperation. And then on the PRC, I think there's a lot to be said, but you already framed it very well by saying that in the 2022 strategic concept, there is that recognition that the PRC does pose systemic challenges to Euro-Atlantic security, and therefore it is NATO's job to look at what they are, map those vulnerabilities, foster transatlantic convergence on responding to those coercive policies and tactics that may undermine our security. And that means a lot of things, from strengthening cooperation with Indo-Pacific partners to looking at issues like resilience of our critical infrastructure, of our supply chain, to continuing to invest in our defense industrial base and maintaining our technological edge. So it is a lot of issues that are really part and parcel of how we, as said before, future-proof for a world of growing strategic competition. So I think all of these issues will be discussed this week in Washington. And the last point, which I would be remiss if I didn't mention, is that you're absolutely right in saying that today, when we think about the different dimensions of the China challenge, we must not forget the fact that today the PRC is the largest enabler of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine through the provision of dual-use goods. And that is certainly something that undermines European stability. And of course, I expect allies to have a discussion about what that means. And of course, from China's perspective, one cannot both want to be a respected member of the international order and fund an illegal war of aggression, and there has to be a reconciling between these two positions.
So is there a mechanism for an allied response to that enabling, as you mentioned, of Russia's war?
Well, I think that part of the discussion at the summit is precisely to identify exactly what we're seeing, which is over the last year really a ramping up from the PRC of support to Russia to conduct the illegal war of aggression. And of course, it's not just the PRC. The PRC is the largest enabler, but we must not forget countries like the DPRK providing ammunitions or Iran providing drones. And what it all amounts to is a situation in which we see increased strategic alignment and concerted action by these strategic competitors and adversaries. And of course, the alliance is looking very carefully at these trends and thinking very carefully about how do we respond effectively to ensure security.
Well, I have thoughts, but maybe it's a good time to go to questions.
Sure. We have a few questions from our online audience, many of which I think our panelists have already touched on. But certainly, I mean, there's a question about sort of growing alliances among authoritarian heads of state and how NATO can best respond to that new dynamic.
Yeah, I think the challenges the alliance face are increasingly global. It's not just, there's some people out there who say, well, the Europeans should focus on Europe, the United States should focus on Asia, and I don't think that makes sense, and in part because the threats are increasingly interconnected. So Russia and China with their no limits partnership, North Korea and Iran providing weapons and munitions to the Russians. And as Fred pointed out in his opening, the ties among this kind of new axis of authoritarians already deeper than the ties between the authoritarians on the eve of World War II. So I think there is a lot of reason to be worried in joint military exercises, joint weapons production, and other things. And so I think part of the solution then is if the problem is global, the solution should be global. And so I think stitching together allies in Europe, North America, and the United States makes a lot of sense. So the NATO IP4 is terrific. It's great that those countries, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, will be here at the summit. I think other similar mechanisms, AUKUS, bringing together Britain, the United States, and Australia, and the G7 increasingly working together on global challenges. So I think this is the future, kind of stitching together like-minded democratic allies globally to address global challenges.
So, I mean, on a related note, there was another question about the continued relevance of NATO in this evolving global environment. And, I noticed you're mentioning a lot of different alliances and groupings that we can stitch together, but the Global South is notably missing there. So how do you ensure that continued relevance, that incorporation of additional voices, government systems and countries?
Well, I would say NATO is an alliance of, as you know very well, 32 member states, but we also have an extensive network of partnerships, and those are very important. It's a tool that we use to foster dialogue, a two-way street dialogue with countries that do not wish or are not members of the alliance but have shared security concerns. And if you look at NATO's partnership networks, it's truly vast. It covers from, as we just discussed, countries in the Indo-Pacific region to our broader eastern neighborhood, to the Middle East and North Africa and the Gulf region. And we have also global partners that go as far away from the Euro-Atlantic area as Colombia, just to give you a sense. So that is a very important message, that NATO is a political military alliance of 32 countries, but it's also an alliance that thrives on building on positive security cooperation agenda with other countries, and that is a very diversified and tailored approach. So with each of these 37 plus partners, we have political dialogue, we have strategic exchanges, and then we have practical cooperation on identified security challenges that we face. And those can be as broad as climate change and security, which is something that we're working very, very intently, for example, with countries in the Middle East and North Africa, to countering terrorism, to enhancing cyber defenses, to countering hybrid threats. So besides what NATO does as core business with the allies, there's also a lot of security cooperation, training, and capacity building that we do with partners. It's something that contributes to our security, contributes to partner security, contributes to a better mutual understanding and political exchange. So what I expect this week is for allies to strongly restate the value of partnerships, but also take concrete decisions to step up what we do, including with partners in the southern neighborhood. So very much along the lines of the question.
Mm-hmm. And separately, you referred to emerging technologies and the ways that those can affect NATO's mission and its core competencies. I mean, what is the alliance doing to incorporate, but also to defend and deter against those emerging technologies as you go forward?
Right. So this has been a very important political priority of the alliance, especially in recent years. We talk about the importance of retaining and regaining our technological edge depending on technologies. And there's a broad set of tools that we have. One is to have shared strategies that look at how to adapt and adopt emerging and disruptive technologies into our defense and security. And we have them on artificial intelligence, quantum, biotechnology and human enhancement, autonomous weapons. This is giving allies a common framework in terms of priority, in terms of how to invest, how to integrate emerging and disruptive technologies into defense and security. And we also do it with an eye to integrating principles for responsible and ethical use, which is really important as an alliance of 32 democracies. So there's this policy framework. We also have practical tools that are designed to encourage transatlantic cooperation around emerging and disruptive technologies. One is a Defense Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic, DIANA, which works with startup companies investing in dual-use technologies that can have a real benefit to our common defense and security. Another one is a Defense Innovation Fund that, again, provides seeds funding to startups that work in deep tech on dual-use technologies that have benefits for our defense and security. And then just this week, I expect allies to make a commitment to expand the capacity of our defense industrial base, and a key component of that pledge will really look at how to continue to invest and step up investment in integrating new technologies into our defense and security. So these are just some of the areas that NATO covers when it comes to emerging and disruptive technologies. But I very much agree with the question that this is a key issue, not just from a military perspective, but also strategically, because in a world of strategic competition, we are competing on many fronts, and the technological race is probably one of the most important ones.
Thank you. We are unfortunately out of time. I think we could all continue this conversation for several hours. But thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Benedetta Berti, Dr. Matthew Koenig, and Ambassador Mike Carpenter, who had to make an early exit, for your insights. And we'll be watching the NATO Summit very closely this week, and stay in touch with the Atlantic Council for more events and programming. Thank you.
Thank you.